He was crowned before he could ride a horse. He led an army before he grew a beard. And he died, not by sword, not by fire, but by drowning in his own armor, fleeing a battle he never should have fought. They found his body tangled in reeds, cold, bloated, face down in the mud. This is not just the story of a young king who lost a war. It is the story of a kingdom that gambled its future on a boy and lost. This is the tragic downfall of Louis II of Hungary, the king who drowned in his own escape. They named him Lajos, born on July 1st, 1506, in Buda Castle, under the burning skies of a kingdom torn between East and West. His mother was Anne of Foix-Candale, a French princess with Valois blood. His father? Vladislaus II, a Bohemian king more interested in music and feasting than warfare. By the time Louis was born, the Kingdom of Hungary was already decaying at its roots. Nobles at each other's throats, taxes unpaid, the borderlands crumbling under Ottoman pressure. But still, he was a child. And like all royal children, he was born into expectation, not truth. They called him the Hope of Hungary, a boy to unite two crowns, Hungary and Bohemia, a boy who would grow into a king strong enough to stop the Ottoman tide. But fate did not wait for him to grow. It shoved the crown on his head before he could understand what it meant. His mother died when he was just 6 months old. His father followed 6 years later. At the age of 10, Louis II became King of Hungary and King of Bohemia. Crowned in Székesfehérvár, with a golden circlet too large for his head, his legs trembling under the royal robes, the orb and scepter held for him by ministers. He didn't command an army. He didn't write decrees. He signed what his guardians told him to. The real power was held by others, by bishops, barons, and bankers. Hungary's ruling elite fought not for the boy, but over him. He was a prize, a puppet, and he began to learn early that power was never something you possessed. It was something others used through you. Yet still, he had a softness. Accounts describe him as gentle-eyed, quiet in speech, with a mind drawn more to books than battle. He studied Latin, theology, and the grim chronicles of Hungary's past, stories soaked in blood and fire. They say he would pause at the tale of his ancestor Sigismund, staring at the page as if trying to remember a past life he'd never lived. Sometimes he would sneak out to the stables. He loved horses, more for their strength than for their speed. And once, when no one was looking, he galloped across the palace yard so fast that he fell. The boy king lay on the stone, dazed, laughing, until a servant rushed in horror to lift him. "You could have broken your neck," they scolded. He only smiled and said, "Then they would finally stop telling me how to rule." But laughter fades, and the crown, even when worn by a child, begins to rot. By his mid-teens, Louis faced an impossible burden. Hungary's defenses were collapsing. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, had already conquered Belgrade. The Danube trembled with fear. Louis, barely 17, was urged to act like a man. His court whispered of alliances, treaties, military reforms. But the treasury was empty. The nobles defied him. And he, still only a boy, was expected to stand against the greatest power in the world. He tried. There were letters to the Pope begging for help. meetings with German envoys, pleas to his Habsburg relatives for soldiers and coin. But they all saw the same thing: a crown on a boy's head, and behind him, a kingdom cracking under its own weight. He began to change. The softness faded. His face grew thin, his eyes colder. A chronicler wrote, "He speaks now as one who no longer hopes, only obeys what fate throws at him." Yet the people still believed in him. To them, Louis was not just a king, he was the final dam holding back the flood of the East. They saw in his youth a divine parallel: David against Goliath, a Christian boy king against the might of Islam. But real life is no parable, and sometimes youth is not a gift, it is a sentence. In 1521, when Suleiman's armies stormed Belgrade, Louis wept. Not because of the loss, he had expected it, but because he had no power to stop it. The bishops blamed his ministers, the nobles blamed his youth, but no one blamed the true enemy: centuries of decay, festering beneath the throne. And so, by 18, Louis II was a king in name, but a prisoner in duty, bound by fear, surrounded by vultures, crowned with thorns. He would ride to war soon. He would try to fight back. But in the silence of his chambers, beneath painted saints and cracked marble, he likely already knew. This was not his kingdom. It never had been. The crown was not placed on his head. It was dropped, heavy, sudden, and unyielding, and it never fit. Louis II was 10 when they led him down the cathedral aisle, the crown of St. Stephen trembling above his thin, pale face. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He simply looked forward, eyes fixed not on the future, but on the stone floor beneath him, as if already sensing where it would all end. The ceremony was grand in appearance. Chorals echoing through vaulted ceilings, incense thick in the air, noblemen kneeling in velvet and silk. But behind the pageantry, the kingdom was fracturing. Hungary was a realm of contradictions, a crown with no spine. A kingdom caught between two superpowers, the Habsburg Empire to the west, the Ottomans to the east. And within, a nobility more loyal to their estates than to their sovereign. At the heart of this crumbling structure stood a child, not yet a man, barely a king, and already surrounded by wolves. His regency council was supposed to protect him. Instead, it tore itself apart. The Archbishop of Esztergom clashed with the magnates. The Diet of Hungary squabbled over taxes, over borders, over who had the right to speak for the boy king. Each noble faction used his name to legitimize their schemes, signing documents in the name of Louis, our gracious sovereign, even when Louis had never read them. He lived like a ghost in his own court. His words were edited before they were written, his meals tasted by others, his every move choreographed by hands not his own. At 13, he tried to assert himself. He ordered the dismissal of one minister. The next morning, the man was back at court, laughing with the nobles who truly held power. Louis never brought it up again. By 14, the weight of the crown had bent his back, not strengthened it. He became withdrawn, quiet. There are no letters of bold ambition, no records of stirring speeches, only scribbled notes of frustration and the silence of a boy aging faster than his body. In 1521, the first true blow struck. Nándorfehérvár, known in the West as Belgrade, fell to the Ottomans. The fortress had stood as Hungary's gate for nearly 70 years. When it collapsed, it wasn't just a military loss. It was psychological decapitation. The court panicked. Nobles fled to their provinces. Rumors spread that Buda would fall next. Louis, barely 15, was summoned to the council chamber and told to lead. Not in the metaphorical sense, in the literal one. He was expected to plan the defense of a kingdom, rally an army, and negotiate with foreign powers. All before he could grow a beard. He tried to respond. He ordered levies. He wrote to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V for aid. He called upon the Pope. But the aid came too late and too little. The court blamed him. Behind closed doors, they whispered, "The boy is weak. He does not inspire fear. Perhaps he is cursed, like his father before him." They didn't say these things to his face, but he heard them. Every whisper, every snicker, every prayer that he would grow faster, act bolder, bleed less visibly. And so, Louis began to shift. He hardened. His portraits from this time show a young man with tight lips and wide, haunted eyes. He adopted armor too heavy for his frame. He trained with swords until his hands blistered. He sat in war councils longer than his generals. But it was not confidence. It was desperation. A drowning boy pretending he could swim. Then came the marriage. In 1522, he wed Mary of Austria, sister of the future emperor, Ferdinand I. It was a Habsburg match, politically arranged, tactically cold. But Mary was intelligent, pious, and far more mature than her husband. She saw through his bravado. She saw the boy beneath the armor. And for a brief moment, just a breath of peace, he smiled again. They shared walks through the palace gardens. She read Latin poetry aloud to him by candlelight. And once, when asked how she found married life, she replied, "I have married a boy made of ice and fire, melting and burning all at once." But even she could not save him from what came next. The Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, was preparing his full assault. This would not be a raid. This would be an invasion. And Louis, now 17, was forced to make a decision that no boy should make. To face the might of the East, or abandon the throne in shame. He chose to fight. Not because he believed in victory, but because dying in battle would be more noble than drowning in indecision. He raised an army, barely organized, underfunded, fractious. The nobles followed him out of obligation, not loyalty. The soldiers marched under banners they barely understood. And Louis rode at their head, not as a general, not as a king, truly, but as a child, dragging a kingdom behind him like a funeral procession. He prayed each night. He clutched a silver crucifix gifted by his wife. And in his journal, one of the few lines preserved, he wrote, "If I return, I will return as a man. If I fall, let it be into God's arms, not theirs." He would not return, and when he fell, it would not be into God's arms. It would be into a swamp, into silence, into legend. It began with hooves, thousands of them. A rumble across the earth like thunder from beneath, not above. The Ottomans were coming. And this time they were not coming to raid. They were coming to erase. Suleiman the Magnificent had prepared his campaign meticulously. This was no opportunistic strike. It was a declaration. Hungary was a cracked door in Europe's defenses, and he would smash it open. Spring, 1526. From Constantinople, Suleiman launched an army of nearly 100,000. Soldiers, archers, Sipahi cavalry, janissaries in their tall white headdresses, they moved like a machine of bone and silk, slow, rhythmic, inevitable. Behind them rolled the cannons, the massive bronze mouths of fire that had devoured fortresses across the Balkans. This was not a war. It was an execution. And Louis II, 17, slight and uncertain, was all that stood in their path. He knew the odds. His advisors whispered treasonous counsel. Retreat. Wait for reinforcements. Let the Habsburgs send men. But Louis, whether out of pride, fear, or some flicker of courage long buried beneath ceremonial robes, refused. If we run now, he said, Hungary dies on its knees. If we fall, let it be standing. He called the Diet, demanded fealty, rallied what he could from the scattered and bickering nobility. What he received was a shadow of an army, fewer than 25,000 men, unpaid, poorly trained, ill-equipped. Many were farmers with sharpened tools. Others were mercenaries, more loyal to coin than to crown. But still, he rode with them. They marched south through blistering summer heat toward the plains of Mohács, a wide, flat killing ground. There, Louis planned to intercept the Ottomans before they could reach Buda. But even geography betrayed him. The terrain offered no elevation, no protection. The rivers to his rear, Drava and Danube, would become cages if retreat were necessary. Still, he chose it. Whether through poor advice or desperate resolve, Mohács was to be his stand. August 29th, 1526. The day would be etched in blood. The morning mist hung low. His soldiers waited silently, their armor sticky with sweat. Louis wore polished breastplate and a helmet too heavy for his narrow frame. A golden cross swayed from his neck. He tried to speak, to inspire, but his words were drowned in the silence of men who already knew. They knew this was not a battle. This was a sentence. At around 3 p.m., the Ottomans arrived, and it began. The Hungarian cavalry charged first, bold and wild. For a moment, just a moment, they seemed to break through the Janissaries' lines. But it was a trap. The Ottoman reserves, hidden in the tall grasses and marshland, sprang forward. Cannons roared, arrows darkened the sky, and the field became a furnace. Men screamed, limbs torn by iron and fire. Horses collapsed mid-stride, crushing their riders beneath them. The Hungarian infantry, ill-prepared and leaderless, broke within the hour. It wasn't a rout, it was a massacre. Witnesses wrote of the earth turning red, of soldiers drowning in blood, not water, of heads severed from bodies before their owners realized they were dead. Louis was told to flee. His commanders begged him. The battle was lost, but he refused at first. He tried to regroup his lines, rode from flank to flank, shouting, waving his sword. "Stand, stand with me," he cried, but there was no one left to stand with. Then came the moment. The enemy broke through entirely. Janissaries rushed the royal standard, and finally, Louis turned. He spurred his horse, retreating toward the Sele Creek. The marshy ground near the river had turned to sludge from the blood and panic. Horses floundered, men slipped, trampled underfoot. He was wearing full armor, steel upon steel, a boy drowning in metal. As he neared the creek, his horse reared, spooked, chaotic, and fell into the mud. Louis was thrown, one foot tangled in the stirrup. He tried to rise, but the armor held him down. The creek was shallow, no deeper than a child's bath, but it was enough. Enough for a boy king to vanish. They found his body 2 days later, face down, mouth open, mud and reeds clinging to his tongue like thorns. Not pierced by a sword, not struck by a bullet, but drowned. Choked by the very armor that was meant to protect him. A grotesque end. The death of a prince not in glory, but in sludge and silence. His enemies mocked him. His allies wept. The nobles who had sent him to war disappeared into their fortresses. And the crown, it did not sink with him. It floated, unworn, bloodless, waiting for the next fool to claim it. The water was still, silent, as if nature itself paused to watch a king die. The Sele Creek was no mighty river, just a thin ribbon of water weaving through the low lands, barely reaching a man's waist. But for Louis II, clad in steel and sweat, it may as well have been an ocean. When his horse collapsed, legs tangled in reeds, panic in its dying eyes, Louis fell with it. He hit the mud face first, the helmet jolting forward, the breastplate locking around his chest. His hands scrambled for purchase, but the more he moved, the deeper he sank. Clay, blood, water, armor, everything closed in. There was no space to breathe, no time to scream, only silence and drowning. They say a drowning man sees his life flash before him. But Louis had lived too fast and too little. What could he have seen? A golden hall? A dead mother? A crown too big for his skull? Or simply the face of Suleiman, distant and untouchable, riding far from the mud where Europe's boy king choked on insects and river scum? The soldiers who fled the battlefield had no time to look back. The Ottomans pressed forward, the bodies piled in ditches, and somewhere among them, Louis's corpse lay unmarked. A prince now food for worms. It was not until 2 days later that they found him. The sun had already scorched the fields. The carrion birds circled low. And there, amid the marsh, a lump of armor half submerged in black sludge. At first, they thought it was a broken siege engine. Then a night. And only when they pried back the visor did they see the face of their king. Bloated, pale blue, the lips curled inward, the eyes open, glazed, unfocused, staring through the men who lifted him out. His skin had split from the pressure. The water had seeped into his lungs, mixing with blood and bile. Leeches clung to his wrists. His fingers were bent backward, hands still clawing at the world that would not hold him. A royal physician would later write, "The king's body was of such condition that no embalming could restore dignity to his form. They could not clean him. They could not clothe him. They buried him quickly, in secret, wrapped in linen soaked with herbs to hide the stench. There would be no state funeral, no long line of mourning nobles, just a hole in the ground, and a silence deeper than in any grave. And yet, it was not just Louis who was buried. It was Hungary. With the king's death, the realm fractured. The nobles, rudderless and panicked, split into factions. One side crowned John Zapolya. Another invited Ferdinand of Habsburg to claim the throne. A war of succession ignited within weeks, and the Ottomans, sensing the chaos, marched deeper into the heartland. Villages were burned, churches desecrated. The Danube became a vein of smoke and fire. Louis's death was not merely a moment. It was a rupture. The young king had been the thread, frayed, thin, trembling, that held the tapestry together. When he snapped, everything unraveled. And yet, in the memory of the people, he did not become a martyr. He became a question, a symbol of what happens when a child is forced to wear a crown forged for giants, a warning written not in ink, but in wrought. Painters refused to depict him. Poets barely mentioned his name. Only a few chroniclers, silent and bitter, recorded the truth. One wrote, "He died as he lived, weighted down by metal not his own." There is something grotesque about the way he died. Not heroic, not tragic in the Shakespearean sense, but humiliating, visceral, wet. There was no audience, no battlefield glory, just a swamp and steel. And in that final image, Louis's body wedged beneath water, armor clinging like a second skin. Was everything wrong with the world he inherited? Too young, too fragile, too surrounded by men who saw him not as a soul, but as a shield. Even the armor that drowned him was ceremonial. It had been forged in peacetime, decorative, beautiful, useless. Its weight was meant for display, not survival. And that, more than anything, was the perfect metaphor for Louis's reign. A kingdom wrapped in gold leaf and rotting inside. A boy made to shine, but never to live. A monarch trapped in ritual while the world burned around him. Today, there is no grand tomb, no preserved crown at the scene of his death. Only speculation as to where exactly his bones lie. Some say his body was reburied later in Zakesfehervar, among the kings of old. Others say it never left the marsh, that the earth claimed him and refused to let him rise again. But his story did not end in mud. It echoed. Every child born into power after him carried a shadow of that drowning. Every throne, no matter how gilded, felt colder. And every soldier marching to war remembered, not the glory of battle, but the silence of a king, face down, lost in water. Louis II was dead. But Hungary did not mourn. It fractured. In the days following the Battle of Mohács, the kingdom fell into a silence far more terrifying than the sounds of war. No bells tolled in Buda. No black banners flew. No council convened to declare national grief. Instead, the noble families locked their gates. Barons retreated to castles, clutching their ledgers, hiding their sons. They had not just lost a king. They had lost the illusion of stability. And in its place, paranoia. Who would take the throne? There was no heir. Louis and Mary of Austria had no children. No dynasty remained. Only empty titles, unsigned decrees, and a throne drenched in mud and shame. The Diet of Hungary, already weakened and corrupt, split like a tree struck by lightning. One half, loyal to the memory of national sovereignty, elected John Zapolya, a powerful Transylvanian noble with native roots. The other, fearing Ottoman expansion and hoping for Habsburg protection, crowned Ferdinand of Austria, Louis's brother-in-law. 2 kings, 1 corpse, no kingdom. Civil war erupted not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, suffocating fog. Raids replaced battles. Assassins replaced diplomats. Every noble's wine tasted of poison. Every ally could be a spy. And above all, the shadow of the Ottomans loomed larger. Suleiman did not retreat after Mohács. He advanced. His armies marched through the heart of Hungary, meeting no true resistance. Towns surrendered without a fight. Villages paid tribute just to be spared the torch. Monasteries were emptied of relics. Cathedrals turned to rubble. The king was gone, and the gates were open. Yet even among the conquerors, a strange reverence grew around Louis's death. Suleiman himself, upon hearing of the boy king's demise, is said to have paused in silence, not out of pity, but out of calculation. A dead king was more useful than a living one. Louis became a ghost, a symbol not of resistance but of vulnerability. His drowned body was proof that Europe's center could collapse from within, that even the crown itself could be too heavy for its bearer. And as his memory faded from public ritual, it festered in private guilt. The nobles, those who had sent a teenager to command armies they themselves were too cowardly to lead, began to break. Some went mad. One baron reportedly locked himself in a chapel for 40 days, eating nothing but ashes and wine, convinced that Louis's spirit would return to curse him. Another disappeared entirely, his estate found abandoned, livestock wandering, servants mute with fear. But guilt was not evenly distributed. Many simply rewrote the story. They claimed Louis had disobeyed their wiser advice, that he had insisted on battle, that his death was a noble sacrifice, not a strategic disaster. They printed ballads, commissioned portraits that never showed the mud, the bloated face, the horror. Only a golden-haired boy in gleaming armor, eyes lifted to heaven. But some remembered. The physicians, the stable boys, the pages who had carried letters he never wrote, messages forged in his name. They whispered among themselves that Hungary had not lost a king. It had murdered one. And in Buda Castle, Mary of Austria locked herself in her chambers. She had heard of her husband's death from a soldier covered in river silt. He had not spoken, only wept. She ordered no funeral, no monument. Instead, she draped his chamber in black and never entered it again. In a letter to her brother Ferdinand, she wrote, "He was born to be gentle, not great. He was given a kingdom, but never a childhood, and we let him drown in both." Mary never remarried. She joined a religious order later in life, disappearing from public view. But Louis never left her. She reportedly dreamed of him often, of his hand reaching from water, of his voice calling her name in a language neither Latin nor Magyar could capture. Hungary too dreamed of him, and not in glory, in nightmares. Louis's death became a warning, a metaphor whispered from father to son. Do not reach too high, or you'll fall in the swamp. Fishermen along the Saley Creek refused to cast nets on the anniversary of Mohács. They claimed the water turned red, that eels thrashed without wind, that the reeds sang a child's voice. Superstition? Perhaps. But grief is not always rational. Sometimes it takes the form of ritual, of fear, of things left unsaid. And Louis's legacy was exactly that, a silence louder than any monument. Even the church grew uneasy. Clergy debated. Had Louis been martyred for Christianity or punished for the sins of a decadent court? Was he a second David, or merely a pawn crushed by history's indifferent hand? No consensus came, only more division, more hesitation. And in that space of confusion, Hungary slipped away. By 1541, Buda would fall completely to the Ottomans. The once mighty kingdom would be partitioned for centuries, never again reunited under a native crown. And it all began with a boy, with a fall, with a drowning. When a king dies, the earth does not shake. The sky does not fall. But sometimes, very quietly, a country breaks. Hungary did not collapse in one day. It bled slowly, like a wound too deep to heal. After the body of Louis II was pulled from the mud, Hungary had no king, no heir, no leader, only fear. And that fear became a vacuum. The Ottomans filled it. Suleiman the Magnificent moved quickly, not with fury, but with precision. He did not sack Buda immediately. He let the country twist. The nobles argued. John Zapolya seized the moment, declaring himself king of Hungary in the east. The Western lords, desperate for foreign protection, invited Ferdinand of Austria to rule. Neither man held the entire kingdom. And in that division, Hungary disappeared. It wasn't erased by invaders. It was abandoned by its own sons. Within months, the land was carved into three pieces. One, the central heartland, occupied by the Ottomans. Two, royal Hungary in the west, ruled by the Habsburgs. Three, the semi-autonomous Principality of Transylvania in the east under Zapolya, and later, his heirs. 3 crowns, 1 corpse, no soul. This division would last for over 150 years. The royal line of Arpad, the medieval nobility, the ancient bloodlines, they were severed. The traditions of the St. Stephen crown, the coronation rituals, the sacred relics, the language of court, fell into dust. Churches were converted to mosques. Latin was silenced by Ottoman Turkish and Germanic dialects. The great libraries of Buda were looted, their parchment burned or sold to Venetian merchants. What remained was fear and silence and memory. And always, underneath it all, the creek. The Kseli Creek, where Louis drowned, became a place of legend. Peasants refused to drink from it. Children were told to stay away or the boy king would pull them down. But Hungary did not need ghosts to remember. It was haunted by its present. Taxes skyrocketed. Young men were conscripted into foreign wars, sent to fight not for Hungary, but for Habsburgs or for Turks. Sons vanished into border skirmishes, daughters sold into marriage for protection, villages burned, rebuilt, burned again. And always the question lingered, what if Louis had lived? But that was the wrong question. The true tragedy was not that he died. It was that he never had a chance to rule. Louis had been crowned too soon, expected to fight too early, and remembered too late. The historians tried to reframe it. In Vienna, he was called the child martyr. In Istanbul, he was forgotten, a footnote in Suleiman's long list of victories. In Hungary, he became a mirror. People saw in him whatever they needed. To some, he was a saint. To others, a symbol of aristocratic failure. To a few, too few, he was just a boy. A boy in armor. A boy who drowned not because he was weak, but because no one ever taught him how to survive. In 1541, 15 years after Mohács, Buda fell. The Ottomans entered without resistance. No army, no king, just keys handed over in resignation. Hungary, once the eastern bulwark of Christendom, was now a vassal state. Europe looked on and did nothing. To them, Hungary was a buffer zone, an expendable shield. The Holy Roman Empire focused on Lutheran rebellions. The papacy debated indulgences while churches in Hungary were burned to ash. Louis's name faded from memory. No statues, No requiems, no songs of mourning. His tomb, if he had one, was unmarked. His death, once a national wound, became background noise. The battlefield at Mohács turned into farmland. The creek flowed as it always had. And yet, even centuries later, when Hungary spoke of its suffering, they always returned to one date, 1526, the year the flood began. Even in 1848, during the Hungarian Revolution, poets invoked Mohács, not as a cry for vengeance, but as a symbol of helplessness. "We are the sons of the drowned king," one line read, "still searching for dry land." But the land had changed. The Hungary of Louis II, the Christian kingdom, the sacred crown, the unity, was gone. It had died with him, gasping for air in a nameless creek. In that sense, Louis was not the last king. He was the first casualty of a much larger death. The death of medieval Hungary, the death of sovereignty, the death of belief that nobility, youth, and divine right could protect against steel, fire, and strategy. And perhaps that was the final cruelty. Not that Louis II died, but that his death was not enough to stop the bleeding. That the real death, the death of a nation, was slower, quieter, and still unfinished. The boy was dead. But the fight for his throne was just beginning. Louis II had left behind no heir, no plan, no peace. And in that void, one muddy crown, two hungry men. On one side stood John Zapolya, voivode of Transylvania. He was native-born, wealthy, politically seasoned. He spoke the language of the people. To many Hungarian nobles, Zapolya was the obvious successor, Hungary for Hungarians. On the other side stood Ferdinand of Habsburg, Archduke of Austria, brother of Emperor Charles V. He was foreign, imperial, armed not with popular support, but with treaties and bloodlines. Before Louis's body had even been properly buried, both men claimed the throne. Zapolya was crowned first in Székesfehérvár, the traditional site of Hungarian coronations. He wore the crown of Saint Stephen, blessed by the archbishop, watched by the nobles who still dreamed of sovereignty. Ferdinand responded by holding his own coronation in Pressburg, modern Bratislava. Not tradition, but power. What followed was not a duel. It was a slow strangulation. Zapolya and Ferdinand fought not just with armies, but with promises. Each man begged for allies. Each man made concessions that cost Hungary more than blood. Zapolya turned to the east. He sent envoys to the Ottoman court. He offered vassalage, tribute, submission in exchange for protection. It worked. In 1529, Suleiman marched into Hungary not as a conqueror, but as an enforcer. He drove out Ferdinand's forces and restored Zapolya to Buda, not as king, but as client, a king on a chain. And Ferdinand? He turned to his brother, the Holy Roman Emperor, to the German princes, to Rome. He promised Catholic orthodoxy. He offered Hungary as a shield wall for the empire. And he made one quiet vow, that one day, the crown of Saint Stephen would sit in Vienna. Hungary was no longer a kingdom. It was a prize. A field on the chessboard of two empires, Ottoman and Habsburg, both eager to play with Hungarian blood. The common people suffered the most. Towns changed hands every year. One spring, Zapolya's men would demand taxes. By autumn, Habsburg troops would return and call those same towns treasonous. Farmers were forced into militias. Merchants paid double tribute. Priests were hung from trees for praying in the wrong tongue. And always, the question remained, what had Louis died for? The nobles didn't ask, they profited. Some backed Zápolya and received Ottoman favors. Others bent to Ferdinand and were given Austrian estates. Both sides became more loyal to foreign thrones than to their own soil. A few protested. A bishop named István Broderiks wrote in despair, "We have two kings, but no country. We have two crosses, but no salvation." Even the church fractured. The Pope recognized Ferdinand, but tolerated Zápolya so long as he remained a buffer against Islam. Religious lines blurred. Catholics fought Catholics. Christian princes bowed to Muslim sultans. And, in the center of this chaos, a throne with no rightful occupant, a corpse no one wanted to exhume, and a people who no longer knew what it meant to be Hungarian. Zápolya tried to secure his legacy. In 1539, he married Isabella of Poland, a woman of royal blood, noble presence, and fierce will. 1 year later, on his deathbed, he had a son, John Sigismund, and again, the cycle began. A child, a crown, a battlefield. Ferdinand rejected the infant's claim. He marched on Buda once more, and the Ottomans, seeing yet another chance to expand, returned. There was no victory, only shifting borders, flickering allegiances, and decades of undeclared war. For the next 150 years, Hungary would exist only in name. The West, ruled by Vienna. The center, ruled from Constantinople. The East, a puppet principality dangling between the two. 3 crowns. No king, no peace. And what of the crown itself? The crown of St. Stephen, the same circle of gold once placed on Louis II's trembling brow, was hidden, moved from cathedral to fortress, guarded, worshipped, feared. It became a relic, not of faith, but of failure. A reminder that power without unity is death. That sovereignty, once fractured, does not heal. And the name of Louis, whispered in blame, his youth mocked. His reign dismissed as a boy's mistake, a footnote before the real kings arrived. But there were no real kings, only caretakers of ruin. Hungary had become a grave, not of one man, but of an entire political order. The last medieval kingdom in Central Europe had not fallen with a bang. It had drowned. And now, scavengers picked over the wreckage. The Habsburgs would eventually triumph. In 1547, after years of blood and diplomacy, Ferdinand was recognized partially as king by the Ottomans. But it was hollow. He ruled from Vienna. He spoke in German. He governed through generals. To his subjects in Hungary, he was not a king. He was a landlord. And the people? They endured. Through war, through occupation, through forgetting what Hungary once was, and who they had once crowned. A boy, a corpse, a cautionary tale. History remembers victors. It sometimes pities martyrs, but it rarely forgives the drowned. Louis II of Hungary did not die on a throne. He did not fall in glory, in light, in scripture. He drowned face down in a muddy creek, alone, armored, forgotten. And for centuries, that's exactly how the world treated him. As a mistake best not repeated, as a silence best not broken. There was no mausoleum, no statue, no holy relic preserved. The exact location of his grave remains uncertain even now. Some say his body was recovered, cleaned as best it could be, and buried in Zakis with the kings who came before him. Others claim it was too damaged, too decayed, too shameful, and that it was left behind, quietly discarded, while the nobles fled. The truth is, no one truly wanted to claim him. The Ottomans did not need a corpse. The Habsburgs preferred a clean slate, and the Hungarian nobles, those who had failed him, would rather bury their guilt than his remains. And so, Louis became a ghost. Not the haunting kind that rattles chains and demands vengeance, but the worst kind, the kind that whispers, unanswered, from the footnotes of history books. Occasionally, a chronicler would mention him, a sentence, a paragraph. Perished at Mohács, drowned while retreating. Nothing more. Painters did not depict the swollen face, the bruised jaw, the pale limbs trapped in steel. They painted him clean, glorious, crowned and serene, holding a sword he never lifted, riding a horse he would later drown beneath. The boy in those portraits is not Louis. He is an idea, a reconstruction, a lie. The real Louis had no final moment of grandeur, no battlefield hymn, no tearful farewell, only mud and silence, and the weight of ceremonial armor pressing his body into the earth like a second coffin. The Saley Creek kept his story better than any historian. It whispered it to the reeds, to the frogs, to the farmers who crossed its banks and swore they felt a chill. They said his spirit stayed there, not out of vengeance, but out of confusion. He had died too young to understand betrayal, too fast to comprehend loss, and far too forgotten to be at peace. Children were warned to stay away from the creek. Fishermen refused to cast nets near the bend where his body was said to be found, not from superstition, but from shame. For they knew, deep down, that Louis had not been killed by the Ottomans. He had been drowned by the indifference of his own court, by the cowardice of men who called themselves counselors, patriots, protectors. And what became of the armor? No record survives. Perhaps it rusted in the reeds. Perhaps it was melted down and recast into coin. Perhaps it still lies beneath the silt, somewhere unseen, holding on to the final breath of a king who was never really allowed to live. But in the popular memory of Hungary, Louis faded, not into legend, but into blankness. There was no cult of Louis, no St. Louis of the swamp, no ballads of the drowned king. He was simply omitted. When Buda fell in 1541, no one spoke his name. When the Habsburgs redrew maps, they began history with Ferdinand, not with the boy in the creek. And when the Ottomans listed their victories, Mohács was about conquest, not the king they left behind. Even the people who once prayed for him now prayed for peace instead. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy, not that Louis II died, but that his death taught no one anything. It changed nothing. It did not unite the country. It did not inspire resistance. It simply passed. And yet, there is a place in every ruined country where memory seeps back through cracks in the pavement. In Hungary, that place is Mohács. Each year, on the anniversary of the battle, the town holds commemorations. Some dress in medieval garb, others read old poems, a few gather at the edge of the river, and in the silence, someone always asks, "Where is the king?" And no one answers, because they know. He's not in a tomb, not in a painting, not in any clean, official narrative. He is in the water, in the soil, in the space between a crown and the head too young to bear it. He is in the broken fields, the divided lands, the feeling, centuries later, that something went horribly wrong and never healed. Louis II is not just a historical figure. He is an unfinished sentence, a ghost story we tell ourselves about what happens when duty is forced upon a child, when power forgets compassion, when a nation watches a boy drown and moves on. Not all crowns are made for heads. Some are made for memory. Others, like Louis VI, are made of silence. It took centuries for Hungary to speak his name without flinching. For decades after Mohács, he was seen not as a king, but as a cautionary tale. A boy who failed, a monarch who never ruled, a mistake clothed in armor and expectation. But time, as always, changes perspective. And eventually, the world began to ask a different question. Was Louis II truly to blame? Or was he simply, inevitably, sacrificed? When the Enlightenment swept through Europe, historians revisited the old chronicles. They sifted through letters, diplomatic records, military dispatches. They traced the decisions made by those around Louis, the bishops, the barons, the foreign powers. And the more they uncovered, the more they realized. Louis had not fallen. He had been pushed by inheritance, pushed by expectation, pushed by a political system more concerned with symbols than survival. He had never commanded his kingdom. He had only inherited its collapse. The army he led at Mohács, raised too late, equipped too poorly, betrayed by factions more eager to preserve their wealth than their land. The throne he sat on, surrounded by men who used his name but never listened to his voice. And the crown itself? It weighed more than gold. It weighed with memory, with legacy, with pressure no child should carry. And still, he wore it. The boy who could not grow a beard led his men into war, not out of ambition, but because no one else would. He signed the orders. He raised the banners. He stood on the battlefield, knowing it might be the end. And when he drowned, he didn't drown in shame. He drowned because no one ever taught him to swim in the world they built around him. Today, that crown survives. The crown of St. Stephen, once hidden in panic, now rests beneath glass in Budapest. People come to see it. Tourists, schoolchildren, diplomats. They photograph it. They admire the craftsmanship. But most walk away without knowing the name of the last boy who wore it freely. Louis II, the king whose death marked the death of medieval Hungary, the end of an era, and yet, perhaps also, the beginning of a reckoning. For what does it mean to give a crown to a child? What does it say about a system that binds a 10-year-old to treaties, to armies, to the weight of a crumbling world? What does it say about a people who would rather protect a symbol than protect the life beneath it? Louis was not the only royal child to suffer. Throughout history, others would follow. Tsarevich Alexei in Russia, hemophiliac and helpless in the hands of Rasputin, Don Carlos of Spain, imprisoned and starved by his own father. Emperor Puyi of China, a toddler placed on a dragon throne as his country fell apart beneath him. Each one wore a crown, each one broke. But Louis's story was different, because it ended not in scandal, not in palace intrigue, but in mud. In the physical, brutal truth of what happens when a fragile boy is asked to stop an empire, when politics forgets humanity, when duty becomes death. There is, of course, no justice in history, only recognition. And in recent years, Louis II has begun to emerge not as a failure, but as a mirror. A mirror held up to a world that too often praises strength while crushing vulnerability. That demands sacrifice, but never accountability. That sanctifies the dead, but ignores the living. Louis's death was not glorious, but in its rawness, in its sheer human tragedy, it speaks more loudly than all the medals, all the proclamations, all the statues of the men who survived him. Because it reminds us that kings can drown, that crowns can kill, that power, without compassion, without protection, without pause, will rot whatever it touches, no matter how young, how promising, how sacred. And so we return to the weight of that crown. It glimmers still, but its brilliance is not pure. It reflects the tears of a queen who never held her husband again. It holds the screams of a battlefield that swallowed a generation. It carries the chill of a creek where the future of a nation sank and never rose. The crown of St. Stephen is not just an object, it is a burden. And Louis II bore it. Not well, not long, but honestly, as no child ever should. If you walk the banks of the Salé Creek today, you will not find a monument. You will not find a statue or a plaque or even a stone. You will find water, still, brown, unmoving. You will hear the reeds whisper in the wind. You will see the mud swell at the edges, and if you stay long enough, you might feel the weight of something just beneath the surface. Not a body, not a ghost, but something heavier. Silence. The kind of silence that history leaves behind when it wants to forget. We remember revolutions. We remember assassinations. We remember kings who ruled long and built great cities. But what of those who ruled too briefly to leave a mark, and yet long enough to be crushed by the expectations others wrote for them? Louis II of Hungary is not remembered because he failed. He is forgotten because he was inconvenient. He died young, in disgrace, in a way that offered no glory, no redemption, no clean ending. He was not murdered. He was not martyred. He simply sank. And that is a hard story to tell because it asks us to look not at what he did, but at what we allowed to happen to him. It forces us to confront the cost of power when placed in the hands of a child, to reckon with systems that prize appearances over truth, bloodlines over merit, obedience over care. It asks us to remember that behind every crown, there is a neck, soft, breakable, human. And behind every battlefield, there is a mother who will never see her son again. A young queen who wakes alone. A people who inherit not just a death, but the consequences of silence. Because it was not the Ottomans who destroyed Hungary. It was the rot already within. The nobles who whispered but never acted. The allies who promised but never arrived. The empire that crowned a boy and left him to drown. Even now, the questions echo louder than any victory anthem. What would have happened if someone had told him, no? No, you don't have to ride to war. No, you don't have to be strong yet. No, you're not ready, and that's not your fault. But no one said no. And so, he went. He rode, he drowned, and the kingdom never rose again. Centuries later, we still draw maps over places where children have died in wars they never chose. We still carve crowns for leaders who inherit disaster without instruction. We still demand strength, even when we know the ones we crown are made of porcelain. So let this be the reflection Louis never received. He was a boy. He wanted peace. He tried to lead. He died. And maybe, just maybe, we should remember him not for what he failed to do, but for what we failed to protect. In the end, there is no statue, but perhaps the absence is the monument. Not marble, not bronze, but the space we carry inside us when we realize what was lost because no one said, enough. Louis II is not a tragic hero. He is a tragic consequence. And the mud that claimed him still clings to the boots of every nation that forgets that crowns are not shields, that titles do not save, and that silence in the face of fragility is a kind of murder. So when you see the crown, behind glass, golden, gleaming, look closer. See the water pooled at its edges. See the mud on the rim. See the boy beneath it, eyes open, waiting for someone to finally say his name without shame. He was not a tyrant. He was not a warrior. He was not even a man. Not yet. He was a boy, dressed in symbols, wrapped in expectations, and left to die in silence. History did not kill him. Power did. The kind of power that demands strength but offers no support, the kind that builds thrones with no staircases, crowns with no compassion. Louis II was never allowed to fail, because he was never allowed to begin. And so he died, with water in his lungs, with armor on his chest, with no one beside him but mud. He does not belong to legends. He belongs to memory. And memory, if we're honest, has not been kind. But maybe it's not too late. Not to build a statue, but to remember what power should never do again. Place a crown on a child's head and call it destiny.